Hello, and welcome to The Art of Aging From Independence to Interdependence. I'm Sherry Gibson-Walters, founder and CEO of Harmony Caregiving. In this podcast, we explore aging not just as a medical reality, but as an emotional, spiritual, and social journey. Today, we're diving into a powerful myth, the myth of independence. It's a word we hear constantly in our work with families. Mom wants to stay independent, dad refuses help, and he says he's fine on his own. But what if independence isn't the ideal we think it is? Joining me today is Saskia Bramwell-Blessing, a registered social worker, graduate student at Carleton University, and someone who's helping us shape care planning and Harmony Caregiving. Saskia, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I'm happy to be here as always. It's nice to get a chance to reflect and talk a little bit about all of the learning that I've been doing at school.
So, Saskia, you and I, we attended the last or the second last symposium for the Anti-Oppressive Gerontological Social Work Symposium, and I would just like you to explain a little bit about that because they did a lot of talking, and I would just like to hear from you about what some of the key pieces from that symposium were to move forward with.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. It's honestly there's so much that we could pull in from that symposium. There's a lot of learning for myself, especially as being someone new to the field. But what I can say that I think we both kind of really took from it and has come up again and again in our conversations is the idea of independence and interdependence. And I think you were actually one of the ones to bring it up in the symposium that you kind of mentioned that you weren't really sure how you felt about independence. Was that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I think it's because I would love for you to step into the conversation that they had about the 12 ladies that were living in that village in Montreal. And they were talking about independence, right? And how they all wanted to live in homes and that they've lived in for 50, 60, 70 years. And in my head, I was thinking about like, wow, like independence after who was that spoke to that again? And maybe you can just share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the professor, her name is Dr. Elda Savoy. Sorry, I have no French experience, so I'm sure I'm not saying her last name correctly. But she did a study on, I believe it was 16 women in rural francophone communities, and there was all women that were living independently in their own homes. And she really just spoke to them about what that experience was like. And I think one of the things that did come up was that idea of independence and can we live independently at a certain age? And what does it mean to be independent? And, I think that from what I remember from what she was kind of explaining, she talked about how these women already kind of see their lives as full and all of their needs are being met. They've built up all of these skills, these ways, these coping mechanisms throughout their life to make sure that all of their needs are met. And yes, maybe certain aspects of their lives they need a little bit of support with here and there, but they live in the communities where they can access that support and they can lean on others and when they need to, and they have that support there already in sort of enveloped in their lives. But one of the things that they face is the community, loved ones, people around them saying, like, oh, you can't live independently anymore because you're out of a certain age, a woman living on her own of a certain age. And it was really interesting to think about how we view people that are aging, especially women, um, how we kind of think that they can't do certain things. We have this perception that that must mean that they've lost some independence or that they should be dependent on others. So, kind of, even though she spoke more about what their experiences were and how they really fostered more independence for themselves, it sparked a conversation in the symposium about what does that mean? Like, is it that they're fully independent or is it that they're also leaning on other people? And, when are they leaning on other people? And when are older adults, when are we as humans depending on others? And then I think we kind of brought this term of like interdependence into it. And so I'll just kind of explain like the difference, like independence. So it's all about yourself. It's all about I'm being a strong, independent woman I am, or even if you think about children, I'm independent now because I can walk on my own, or I'm independent now because I've learned how to drive at 16, or I'm independent now because I'm 18. We have all these like markers of independence in our lives.
Mhm.
And so I think independence becomes like this glorified term of like, okay, this is us doing things by ourselves. But I always wonder, like, are we actually doing those things by ourselves? Not fully. I was not fully independent at 18, even though I was out living on my own. I still depended on other people. I still had people around me. And so that's where, the term interdependence was brought in of we as humans are interdependent. We don't do everything absolutely on our own. We have help. I guess if I think about it in like a very broad way, grow my food. I don't clean my water. I don't heat my home. I don't do any of those things. There's other people in communities that are making sure that all those things happen. And if I didn't have that, I wouldn't exist. So am I fully independent? Am I doing every single thing to meet every single need that I have all on my own? No, I'm not. And none of us ever are. So why do we focus so heavily on that independence when we age? Why does that become like the big focus?
Yeah, it's like I think you've described it before as that is actually like independence is like the gold standard or something that everybody strives for. Really, that just isn't the case. And I think one of the things that came to me in that conversation with about those ladies was that whole idea that this social worker is coming to visit them to find out what life is like living in that they lived in for 50, 60 years. And the biggest thing was they're comfortable there. They know where everything is. They have lived there for so many years. They actually have their own little crafting things that they like to do, and then they can show off their crafts when people come. And that's where they're most comfortable. But I think where the idea about like the fear of being asked or forced, I think not asked to move, but forced to move, is where a seniors come from when they see like the term social worker coming out to the home, for example. There is that fear. They have the duty to report. So I think seniors are like scared of that. And one of the other things that's struck in me was like one of our vision statements was inspiring independence. And we were kind of back and forth on the word independence and inspiring independence. And I'm like, is that what people really want? Is independence? And then I remember one of the ladies, one of our consultants, our care managers, one of our care managers actually talked about exactly that thing when she brought up a client and the client said, I don't really understand why everybody wants me to like inspire this independence thing in me. Even when I was married, I was not independent. I was still counting on my husband for things and we were together. And so all of a sudden I hear this be independent or you want to be independent or there's even like a name attached to this type of living in our communities where it's like independent living. So, can you speak to that a little bit, Saskia? Because it is kind of what you're saying is that we're still encouraging people, seniors, and assuming that that's actually what they want.
I think the big word you say there is assuming. I think we get stuck in that assumption. And this goes for any area of life, stage of life, interactions with each other. We base a lot of things on assumption. And that happens so much as people age that people are coming in assuming that they know, assuming that, oh, I know better because I've learned a bunch of things or because I'm still independent and not assuming that the other person is not independent, assuming that that older person doesn't know what they want or can't make those decisions for themselves. And I think it's important, to say and of course acknowledge that there are people that need support with decision making. That is something that we deal with all the time at Harmony, and cognitive challenges, cognitive decline is a huge part of that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't opportunities for that decision making to still happen. So we really need to look at how we can incorporate people into that. I think we've talked about that quite a bit, but it's, even with that knowledge of, okay, we need to make decisions together, we still often come with the assumption that we know what people want and, and think that we know that they need to be independent in all of these different activities of daily living. Like, I think that's actually even in some of the assessments is are you independently able to do these things? And if you're not, then you need to move into a senior's home of some kind. Or if you're not able to do this, then you have to yeah, have some kind of support. And that's really scary. It's scary because like that lady might have said, maybe her husband was the one that used to help her make sure that she was safe in the shower.
I'm sure that
Yeah,
that is exactly who helped her in the shower, right? Because that ex
right.
interdependently. Yeah, so I really appreciate that
Yeah.
perspective on, couples.
I think I was thinking about this last week, as we've been talking about this, and it's been coming up a lot. But when we're looking at how to support older adults, I think it's not so much about fostering that independence or maintaining, like, yes, we want to maintain aspects that people can be independent in. That's not a bad thing. I do think that there's value in having some level of independence, but we have to look at where are those interdependent pieces falling short, because as we get older, unfortunately, our support systems do change. People pass away, people move away, children become caregivers to their own children and they're not able to be supportive. So some of those pieces that you had, those social supports you had around you that you could depend on start to shift and change and sometimes disappear. And so what we're really talking about when we're talking about caregiving is that we need to replace that interdependence that's missing. We need to make sure that that person is receiving the same level of support that they always have been, and just enhance it in maybe some ways that they themselves are changing. So it's not necessarily like they need to be independent. It's how can we shift and move to support that person and make sure that all their needs are met.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I guess, the shift in my thought process around it is meeting people's interdependent needs rather than just their independent ones.
Yeah, no, I think we love that idea, right? And I think being able to talk about the two terms and just even informing people about the term interdependence and, that it's not something to be embarrassed about or it's at all, right? I think that sometimes people think when, like, if you were to position it as, you know what, we're like a partnership, dad. I still think the aging senior or the aging adult, can think of that as like, I'm a failure or now I'm being a burden on my you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's it's a deep issue, and there's a lot that I could say about it. I'll just mention that I do think that it comes from an entire society of believing that it's not okay to lean on others, believing that how we have to be independent. And so of course when people get older, that's how they're gonna think, because that's how we all think in, let's say, in the Western world. I'm not gonna say that that's the case everywhere, but we live in Canada. We're in a very individualistic society. And so we do need that independent, or think we need that independence. And so it can be hard to want to look at things as a partnership, especially with someone that you used to be the caregiver. If it's my dad, he used to be my caregiver. He
Yeah.
probably doesn't want to think about it that way, that all of a sudden, wait a second, I used to have authority in our relationship and now we're a partnership, or now you have authority. It's confusing, and it's not, people don't deal with change easily. Nobody really does. So it's about making that transition easier, and recognizing that it's hard, recognizing that it's hard for both people. It's hard as the child and it's hard as the parent too.
I actually am also thinking about the interdependence, and you'd mentioned the Western society, and then yeah, us as a Western society, and how we actually, you know, care for people that are aging. And I think that it actually sparks the intergenerational living, which is, you talked about how your dad lived with you and then took care of you. And if you have to take care of him, what's that going to be like? And it's probably going to be embarrassing. And your dad will probably think, it's a sign of weakness. Your dad won't probably, but
Yeah.
the fact that he's worked in this industry and has had to process these things. But for somebody else where the roles are reversed, I do think that that is a very difficult thing for people to navigate, and we just need to say that it's not really about being weak. It is actually about being in like a meaningful relationship. But the part for my is that we have young children, so we have toddlers, and my mother lives in her own suite within our home. So I do see that, and it usually is very reciprocal, but sometimes the weight could be carried by one a little bit more depending on how somebody's medical health, declines or their cognitive health.
I love it. I think it connects to so many ways that we as humans used to live and exist, and it to me feels like a very natural way of supporting each other and moving towards more of that community-based collective support, supportive society rather than just focusing on that individualistic aspect, but how much that older person also contributes to the other generations. And I think
Absolutely.
that's something we forget, where older adults think that they're just being a drain on everyone else, but they're not actually contributing. Does that kind of
Yeah,
dynamic show up?
sure. I think that definitely shows up in our world a lot. It does boil down to communication, and it does boil down to, like, really listening and, allowing them the opportunity to say what they want. And when they say what they want and what the other person wants, it's about coming up with what works best for both parties. But we definitely see that.
Yeah, and that's a good question. Let me just bring up the names of the stages again because those stages, he has 8, and then there's been a ninth one that's added. So sometimes the names of them just skip my mind. But so Erik Erikson was a developmental psychologist. And this is something that I learned in like first year university. So let's just put that out there that this is, there's many new theories since this has come out, but this is just one way of looking at how people develop over the years.
Mhm,
And I thought it would be kind of an interesting way to look at independence and aging. And we'll just start with the seventh stage because that's where we start to move into aging. So the seventh stage is generativity versus stagnation, and that usually happens like age 40 to 65. But we know that life is not exactly linear like that. Things aren't black and white. So sometimes that can happen earlier or later. But this stage is really about contributions. We talked a little bit about that contribution, like your mom being able to contribute to your family and how that supports not only you, but your children. And I think that that's where that stage becomes really important. The next generation or to society or to others around you. And it's really important to feel like relevant in that stage. If you start to feel less useful or you start to feel like you're not needed, that can kind of cause what Erikson would refer to as like an identity. It's about it being like a challenge of your own identity because you can't really meet that stage of your life. You're struggling to feel like you're contributing. And that's where those feelings of like resistance and those challenging feelings come up because you don't feel like you're giving back to the world around you, which is why it's generativity versus stagnation. And so it's really about reminding everyone that there's still value and that there's still so much to give as we age, that you don't become irrelevant as you age. It's, we lean more and more on the people in the older people in our lives to get wisdom from them, to learn from them, all these things. I think for us as a society, we really need to see this stage from that strengths side of things and see how that age group is still contributing rather than seeing the areas where they're maybe not able to contribute in the same way they could before.
mhm, exactly.
That makes
Yeah, I do
sense.
think that's important. It's focusing on what they can do, not what they can't do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's uplifting the strengths that they have, uplifting the things, enhancing the things they can do, and using those to help them meet those other needs that maybe they can't do anymore. Maybe they have this rich social life, and even though their physical body is struggling, we can use that beautiful social circle that they've built to support those physical things that they're no like driving that they can't do. Hey, but they have 10 friends that they hang out with all the time that can still drive, so let's bring those people in. It's using one area of a person's strengths to meet the needs of another area where maybe they're not as strong anymore and not able to do those things anymore.
It actually reminds me, Saskia, of a story I heard the other day from a lady who had chosen to move into like a supported living community. And basically, she's very involved in her church, and she chose and decided to make sure that she was living in a place that allowed her to be able to get there with low expense to get there, and also the ability to get there like walking if she she wanted to, because that piece of the church and belonging to the church is so important to her. So I think that's like a really good example of how when somebody's in that stage, you have to really look at what's important to the people. 'Cause I think sometimes the opportunity to select the communities that a person wants to live in, if they have to move into like, a community of some sort, that they really look at matter. So location to where a family member might live so that it makes it really easy for that person to get visitors. Or in this particular case, the church is a huge part of her purpose left in life. And she sure that she can do that as long as she absolutely positively can, knowing that at some point mobility may become a challenge for her if it's not already, you know?
And I think it all flows together. Like you just talked about the importance of letting people lead their decision making. It's I'm going to move, so I need to make sure I'm moving close to my church and to my community. And that really does, it is still important in the next stage. But the next stage kind of moves from this needing to contribute to society to more of like a reviewing life stage. And it's called integrity versus despair. Often happens between like 65 to 80 plus. People want to think that their life mattered. So they want to be able to, for example, look back on that contribution stage and feel like they contributed and feel like they had this sense of success or wholeness in their life. And at the same time, it's also an important stage for people to accept the things that maybe weren't as perfect or the way that they wanted them to be, and to be okay with the fact that maybe certain things in their life didn't work out, but you know what? This is what I contributed and I'm okay with that. So it's kind of this grappling between I feel like my life mattered and I'm okay with the parts of my life that didn't go the way that I planned. And so that stage, you know, I think it's a lot about recognition in that stage, recognizing and acknowledging people's lives and their knowledge and their stories and what they have to bring and to share. So some of the things that are talked about to sort of support people in that stage are, like inviting people to engage in storytelling. So, hey, tell me a story about this part of your life. I want to know more. Or inviting people to give some, advice or guidance on, "Hey, when you had your first baby, like, what did you do? Oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing." Bringing that, giving people opportunities to share their knowledge and their strengths because they're at the stage where they can look back and they can see, "Hey, I have contributed a lot and I have things that are of value," and they want to be able to share those things.
That's really good. One of the biggest things is really listening to, like, what matters most to them right now, right? So no matter if they're in the 7th, 8th, or ninth, it's like, what matters to them now? Or if they can't verbalize that, it's like, think about them and determine, like, what matters to them right now, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that just going back to independence and interdependence, that is a big part of it. What's most important to that person right now? And again, saying that independence isn't the most important thing, that might be what people say is the most important thing, is that they want to feel independent. And I think that that's okay. We can support that. But again, it's just looking at, if that's what someone really wants, what can we do to support them so they feel independent? What can we do to make sure that, yeah, just to meet those needs in a way that they still feel like they're doing it kind of on their own, or they still feel like they have control, or they still feel like they have some power or decision making in that. Yeah, it all comes down to, I think, making more inclusive and collective decisions rather than just thinking I have to do this for myself or I have to do this for you. It's how can I do this with you? How can I be there with you in this part of your life? Because you've been with me in so much of my life and I want to be there with you. I think
Yeah.
that's really what it's about.
I think you talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but the ninth stage is something that was added after, Erikson's 8 stages, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the ninth stage was added by Erikson's wife, Joan Erikson, after he passed away. And I mean, I know you and I have wondered if, her caring for him was part of her developing this ninth stage. We don't really know.
Yeah.
but it is part of that sort of the next, or often seen as the last stage of life. And she talks about how people revisit a lot of the other stages at this point. And so one of the early stages is trust versus mistrust. And so that sort of is revisited again in older age, because this is a stage where people are becoming very vulnerable a lot of the time, whether it's cognitively, physically, or both. There is increased vulnerability. And so when you're vulnerable, you really have to put trust in other people to support you. You have to put trust in the world. You have to you even have to put trust in yourself that, okay, I had a fall, but I trust that my legs are going to work again. This happened to me, but I trust that I'm going to be able to work through it in some way. Even though certain aspects of your body or your mind might be not functioning the same. So it's really that grappling again with learning how to trust this new part of your life, these new stages, learning how to trust when you've lost parts of yourself or parts of your life. So that's part of the ninth stage. And it also talks about revisiting other areas of your life and kind of deepening all of those stages. So that might be different for each person, but it might be going back to that generativity of how have I contributed, but deepening it to another level. So you're kind of in this stage where everything is kind of coming together as a whole, and you're like, okay, this is how I can learn and shift and see this learning that I had earlier in life in a new way, on a new level. And with that, I think comes some level of spiritual meaning as well. There comes some deeper understanding spiritually, or maybe people don't like the term spiritual, but it's like, I think you said earlier, it was existential, this existential understanding of life. And so that is, I think moving beyond oneself and seeing how their life exists in like a greater whole and something that goes beyond themselves. And so the stage, there can be grief, there can be stages of forgiveness. There can be lots of different aspects that come into this stage. And so I when I think of that stage of life, I wonder, what are the emotions that people are experiencing at that stage when they're moving through so much and reflecting on so much.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
fascinating.
I think that it is fascinating. And it's actually, so that was the term that was used to describe that was actually the gero transcendence, because it wasn't, there was like, remember we were looking at that, and it was between Joan Erikson, um, another gentleman, another psychologist from Sweden. And
Yes.
so the two are sort of like, I think Swedish gerontologist was Lars Tornstam. And so it's
Yes.
exactly like you said, where they actually did become more accepting of life. And that included the parts about joy and suffering. So yeah, it's the similar things that they talked about. And it's just who took what from who, according
Yeah.
to your, but it basically is a deep shift from independence and achievement towards wisdom, connection, and like that piece of peace in life, so that it makes the transition much, much gentler, I think, when they have that sort of inner peace, right?
Yeah. I think that's so interesting that it's again moving from independence, you're thinking of your life as part of a whole rather than as it on its own. It's not that my life only exists in a vacuum and I'm here by myself. It's like existing in this greater thing. And I wonder if that's part of the peace that comes. Like, I'm not saying this from any research here. I'm just saying this from my own thought process.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if that's part of the peace that comes, we're fighting so much in life to be this independent, to be strong, to be taking care of ourselves, to be making sure that we have all of our needs met. But then when we kind of are able to let go of that and just say, like, I'm at peace with all the things that I have in my life, and I'm happy to have like all these people around me supporting me. I'm grateful for all of those things. I've grieved the parts of myself that I've lost, or the things that I'm not no longer able to do. And then it just brings that peace because we realize, like, hey, I'm not alone.
I think so. And you and I were talking before about like when somebody is given like a terminal illness diagnosis, right? Uh-huh.
And that could be really hard for people to hear and for people to believe. And it's interesting that I think that a lot of the time has to do with age. If someone's young and they're saying, I'm at peace with dying, it's like it doesn't compute for a lot of us. We can't understand it because we haven't moved through all those stages. We haven't done all of that work. And so I think it's important to recognize like, hey, we're in earlier stages of development. We haven't gone through all of that. And for people with illness, terminal illness, or that are going through that, or for people that are aging, they deserve to be recognized for whatever stage of development they're in and how much knowledge and processing and information and learning they've had to do to get to that stage because it's not easy and I can't understand it. I'm definitely not at any of those later stages yet. So how can I possibly think that I know what people need? How can I possibly think that I know what's right for someone when I haven't even been close to that stage and gone through all of that learning.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to that whole piece about the communication where you're really just asking questions and listening and being curious about where they're at. And they're tough conversations to have, but I do think that it helps them to move through those transition phases or stages with much more ease. One of the things too, Saskia, about this whole thing is that sometimes we can get family members in an attempt to do things well for their loved one. There's a fine line between support and control. And it's basically like a fear of loss. Control brings it to then the person sort of shuts down. Is there anything that you can suggest or any other reasons besides the fact that they just aren't at the stage where they're ready to accept that help? Is there anything that you can speak to in terms of recognizing that the person may consider it to be control or versus autonomy? There is, of course, like a fine line between support and control. And I know that there's was a big part about um, this fear of loss of control, which can bring people to, I think it's all from a caring space, but can you speak to that a little bit? Just the fine line between support and control and sometimes people just don't think people are living in a safe situation. And so what is your thought around that?
Yeah. So first, I guess I'll say that I think it turns into control when it's something that we think is right for that person without having considered what they might want. And I think people can get scared as we get into later stages, especially when there's cognitive decline, because we have to make those decisions. We have to say, I know what this person, like, I need to make this decision for this person. But where it turns into control is again just not considering, even if that person can't be actively part of that decision making for something major in their lives, have you considered what they might have wanted? Have you considered how they perceived life? Have you considered the types of things that they wanted for their life and incorporate that into your decision making? So I think that's a big part of shifting out of that control and shifting into support. Another part of control is, thinking that we know what's safe, thinking that we know what's right. And safety is different for everyone. Everyone feels safe in a different space. And so if we start to say, this is what's safe for you, there's going to be resistance. There's going to be something that people are going to feel like, well, how do you know what's safe for me? I've been fine my whole life and safe and all these things. So, thinking about safety being individual to each person, there's a lot that comes with that of how we can try and foster that sense of safety. Unfortunately, a really difficult thing that we have to acknowledge sometimes is that people also have the right to live with risks. We do it every single day. I choose to drive my car every day. I choose to walk across the street every day. There's risks that come along with that. There's risks that come along with a lot of things that we do in life, and that's a natural part of life. And that doesn't just stop when we age. Those risks sometimes, yes, or most of the time, yes, they do increase as physical and cognitive abilities decline. But ultimately, we as humans have the right to choose to live at whatever level of risk and safety we feel is good for us. And again, if that person's decision making capacity has been challenged or questioned or taken away in some form, then that's a little bit of a different story. But when people still have that ability to make decisions for themselves, we do have to acknowledge that it's okay to live at risk sometimes. It's okay to have a different idea of what safety looks like for them, and to just do what we can to support them with that. So maybe it's okay, they're going to live on their own, so I'm just going to help remove some of these fall hazards. I'm
Yes.
going to help to make sure that the oven is, they don't ever cook. So I'm just going to disconnect the oven because they don't do it anymore anyways, and they don't have to think about it. And if something happens, I don't have to worry about it. So just, even though people have the right to live at risk, we can still do things to support them in their safety.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about in the following episodes is that whole idea of getting those things in writing, because then those decisions are kind of made ahead of time too, like with regards to the bigger safety issues like swallowing challenges and falling. And do they stay in their home after a fall, and all of those things that if those decisions are made with the person ahead of time, then it takes a lot of pressure off of the families too. So I think that that's like important conversations to have, but it's really tough to do. So I think that, us talking about interdependence and about the conversations that are important to have. I was actually remembering a client that we had who family was very loving and absolutely wanted to make sure that their loved one enjoyed a really good end of life. And, halfway through that, they were looking at the documents that they had written out with their mom before, or they had written out with their parent, and realized, geez, you know what? She doesn't even want to be on this type of regime at the care. So they went back to saying, if she does not want that, that was her wishes that were laid out in writing before she had major cognitive decline. And then they were able to help make that honoring of her wishes. They were able to put those in motion, but still making sure that she was safe to do so. So I think that's a really interesting thing. People get scared, right? It's the loved ones that get scared, don't want that to happen, or they don't want to find their loved one in a certain circumstance. But it also gives them the opportunity to prepare a little bit better. And if they can mentally, then I think that that does make it a little easier on everybody. And you're honoring what your loved one wanted in the beginning. And they looked back and the document was there, right? So I really want to thank you so much for all that you bring to the conversations, because I think, the term interdependence, sure, we may have heard that term, but what does it really mean to people when they're aging? And what does it really mean for the family members? So I know that there'll be a lot more of these talks because we dug deep in a lot of those things at the symposium. What are your thoughts about like some of the next conversations that people should look forward to hearing from you on?
Yeah, well, I know that I think, we've touched on it a bit today, but there's always more that can be said about how to support people with resistance. So that's probably something that we can explore a little bit further. And then in terms of more learning from the symposium, we do really want to dive into the intergenerational living and learning. There's just so much richness that can come from that, and I think that deserves its own episode in and of itself.
It's Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so we'll talk a little more about that. And then, I think we always want to make sure that we're applying this to real life to make sure that this is, applicable to the clients that are at Harmony. This is applicable to people's real challenges. So sometimes we talk about topics in a very high level, like philosophical way. I know that I do that a lot. And so bringing that into life, bringing that into practice, what does it look like? I think you can expect us to definitely explore that a little bit more over the next few episodes.
And a great reminder for our guests to stay tuned to us as we sort of dive deeper and get more familiar with these topics that not everybody talks about. So thank you. Appreciate you bringing this framework to us. And for our listeners, thank you for listening. We encourage you all to embrace the moment, seize the day, and carpe diem until next time.
Thank you, Sherry. Nice to see you.
You too. Thank you, Saskia.